For Voltaire and for Adam Smith, capitalism was a way of bridging differences between cultures and between societies. But to others, the spread of the market looked like a threat to the very existence of their culture and their society. And one of those was Justus Möser, who lived from 1720 to 1794, which made him a contemporary of Adam Smith and of Edmund Burke. Möser provides us with an interesting example of a conservative in a pre-commercial society, a society on the periphery of capitalist development, a society that was being transformed by capitalism in ways that threatened the traditional way of life of that society. As you'll see, Möser was in many ways a precursor of contemporary critics of what we now call globalization. One of the ongoing motifs of that criticism is the notion that the spread of international capitalism undermines the economic basis of existing communities and societies. Möser was born and lived most of his life in Osnabrück, which was a small state, really just a town and its hinterland, an area of less than 50 square miles with about 125,000 inhabitants. It lies in Western Germany, not very far from the Dutch border. This was one of the 300 states into which German-speaking Europe was divided before the era of the French Revolution. Möser came from a family of lawyers and town administrators. He was also a lawyer by training, and he served for much of his life as the chief administrator of Osnabrück. Indeed, from the age of 24 until almost his death in 1794, he was the central political figure in this tiny state. But he was also an author who published articles on a wide range of contemporary public issues in newspapers and in magazines. These articles were collected and published between hardcovers in 1775 under the title Patriotic Fantasies, though perhaps a better translation of the title would be The Local Imagination, for that was the nature of the society that Möser was trying to protect, a local one. In that he contributed to newspapers and magazines and books, Möser was part of that print culture of public debate that was such an important element of the Enlightenment. Indeed, Möser sometimes debated with himself. In an attempt to reach a wide audience, he would often publish 2 or 3 articles with differing perspectives on the same issue, such as, should peddlers be permitted in Osnabrück? Each article was written in the voice of a protagonist, often an enlightened reformer on one hand and a supposedly more down-to-earth conservative critic of the reforms on the other. And usually, though not always, the conservative argument was presented as more convincing. In any case, Möser's significance for us lies in the way in which he provided an articulate voice of cautionary, conservative views within the German Enlightenment. Like Edmund Burke, Möser was a conservative, but the society that he wanted to conserve was a pre-commercial one. Political and economic institutions of Osnabrück that Möser defended in his writings were medieval in origin and feudal in their conception. And that institutional world was in the process of being destabilized by the solvent of the market economy. For Justus Möser, the international market was pernicious because it was destroying the particular local culture of Osnabrück. That is to say, it was destroying what made life in Osnabrück unique and special. The international capitalist economy did so first by creating new wants that couldn't be fulfilled by the traditional economy of the region. And second, as we'll see, it was destroying the traditional guild-based modes of production and the social and political structures that were intertwined with that guild-based production. It was destroying these through competition from commodities that could be produced more cheaply abroad. In the subsequent development of capitalism, this fear would often be repeated, that local cultures and social structures faced destruction by competition from goods from abroad. The enlightened German political writers of Möser's day regarded the market as a tool that encouraged economic growth, something they were very eager to foster. The state and its citizens, they reasoned, could become richer if men were allowed to follow their natural self-interest, as they called it. Like Adam Smith, they believed that the task of the law was to create the conditions of free competition that would allow the economy to grow. So they urged the monarchs and their bureaucracies to do away with traditional institutions that restricted the sale of land, the movement of labor, and entry into occupations. In short, they wanted laws that would provide greater legal equality. And that would create the conditions for a more economically dynamic society. But creating those conditions meant doing away with many existing historical institutions. The society that Möser defended was a hierarchical, corporate society of ranks, what's called in German a Ständestaat. In such a society, property wasn't private. It was linked to power. And that power included the control that noble landowners were able to exert over their serfs. Since medieval times, the residents of the countryside had been made up of a handful of noble lords and a mass of serfs, along with some peasants who supported themselves by farming. The nobles owned most of the farmable land in the state of Osnabrück. They lived on their rural estates. They derived much of their income from feudal dues that were paid by the serfs or from the rents that were paid by legally independent peasants. In a society like that, it was considered unsuitable for a noble to work as hard as a commoner, or as long as a commoner, or for the same pay as a commoner. And unlike the commoner, the noble was exempt from taxation. So it was a whole way of life that was distinguished from commerce. The lord's holdings were passed on to his descendants and couldn't be bought and sold. The serf wasn't free to own land and couldn't move without the permission of his lord. The free peasants were not serfs, but they typically acquired their land through hereditary leasehold. In other words, they inherited it from they inherited the lease from their parents. Nobles, serfs, and independent peasants lived their lives barely aware of the market economy. Of course, the market, in the sense of the exchange of goods mediated by money, had played some role even in this traditional society of Osnabrück. But for most lords or serfs or peasants or artisans, the market was marginal to their existence. The peasant household produced much of what it consumed and consumed most of what it produced. From time to time, the peasant went to the town market to sell excess eggs, butter, poultry, vegetables that they had grown, and to use the money to buy some of the products of the artisans of the town. Those artisans sold what they themselves produced, usually without the intermediary of a merchant or a shopkeeper. So merchants and their commodities had traditionally played a small, marginal role in the life of Osnabrück. The town economy was organized into guilds of artisans. There were separate guilds for blacksmiths, cobblers, bakers, tanners, butchers, carpenters, cloth makers, and so on. Each guild had a monopoly of production and marketing of the commodities that it produced. And guild regulations specified the conditions under which new people could be accepted into the guild, new apprentices, including provisions that they be of good character and of honorable birth. After years of working with a guild master the apprentice eventually moved up to become a journeyman and eventually rose to become a master himself, after demonstrating his skill by producing a masterpiece. The political representation of members of the guild was through the guild itself. Each guild elected a guild master who represented the members of the guild on the town council. And the policies of the guilds and of the town councils that they dominated was to restrict admission into their trades and to press for exclusive rights to sell their products in the town and the surrounding countryside. And each guild had the right to enforce its monopoly by confiscating products that came in from outside the town and that the guild itself produced. As in other parts of Osnabrück society, what a man's parents had been largely determined his own vocation. In admitting new apprentices, the sons of masters were given advantages. In a society like this, status was inherited. It wasn't achieved. It was a society oriented towards stability, not to growth or dynamism. Social relations were based on deference and paternalism. Deference, that is, you were supposed to look up to those above you in the social hierarchy. Paternalism, you were supposed to look out for those below you in the social hierarchy. According to Möser, one advantage of such a society was that everyone knew their place in the social order. In Möser's view, a person acquired his identity from his place in the institutional structure of society, a society in which economic, social, and political institutions weren't distinguished from one another. His status, a person's status as a guildsman, or a noble landowner, or a serf, or an independent peasant, determined not only how he earned his living, but his sense of who he was, of what his duties and obligations were, of those to whom he ought to defer and those who ought to defer to him. So Möser's defense of such a society emphasized the benefits of knowing one's place, the importance of belonging to an existing collectivity, and therefore the need to cultivate loyalty to existing institutions because they provided the individual with a firm sense of place. In contrast to the Enlightenment's typical emphasis on individual opportunity and individual autonomy, Möser valued those institutions that circumscribed the individual, that surrounded him, if in doing so they provided a firm sense of identity. And so what conservatives saw as stability, Enlighteners saw as stagnation. What conservatives like Möser saw as institutions that gave men a sense of identity, gave men a sense of being a part of a world of clearly defined markers, enlightened bureaucrats saw as limiting opportunity and limiting individual creativity. Our ancestors, Möser wrote, were guided by experience rather than by theories. And this contrast between experience and theory was often repeated by Möser and became a staple of later conservative thought. Experience, it was said, embodied a wisdom which general theories of justice and efficiency just couldn't match, because the wisdom of experience took into account that the functions of existing institutions were interlinked, that guilds, for example, were interlinked with familial institutions, because if you were a member of the guild and you got sick or you died, the guild would look after other members of your family. And because institutions were interlinked, reforming one institution might have destructive effects on other institutions. So Möser often saw his role as a conservative intellectual as discovering and making explicit the tacit wisdom of existing institutions and practices. Well, Möser scandalized enlightened intellectuals of his day by defending the institution of serfdom, that traditional paternalistic relationship between the lord and serf, in which the serf was the lord's legal property. In fact, Möser claimed serfdom as it actually existed in Westphalia was superior to economic relationships based upon the legal freedom of both partners, that is, the Enlightenment ideal. He argued that once the serf had redeemed himself by buying his legal freedom through a cash payment to the Lord ended up losing all interest in the serf and his welfare. Möser writes that a serf is like a horse that is owned by a carriage driver. Since the carriage driver owns the horse permanently, it's in the owner's interest to look after the horse and maintain him in good condition. But a peasant farmer who rents his land from a landowner is like a rented horse, which one exploits as much as possible without concern for his future welfare. By the way, similar arguments were made in the antebellum American South regarding the supposed advantages of slavery over free labor on precisely these grounds. But the traditional society of Osnabrück was being transformed by the spread of capitalism in a number of ways that alarmed Möser. The artisan was central to Osnabrück's political institutions, as Möser thought of them. He was the one who paid taxes. He was the one who could be called upon in times of war to provide quarter for professional soldiers. He was the one that provided traditional products to meet the customary needs of the people of the region. So as Möser saw it, economic privileges, the monopoly that the artisanal guilds had, and their political duties were neatly intertwined within a stable economy. But the status of these gilded artisans, Möser believed, was now being undermined by the international market and its local agents, namely the shopkeeper and the peddler. The shopkeeper imported goods from outside of Osnabrück and sold them in his shop. These goods came from London, Paris, from big cities in Germany, where they were produced by a process that Möser called simplification, by which he meant that process of manufacture represented by Adam Smith's pin factory, where in place of the gilded master artisan who worked with a few apprentices, this new style of production involved a master who employed 30 or 40 wage laborers. The process of production was broken down into steps, each of which was performed by a worker who specialized in that phase, as opposed to the traditional artisanal mode of production where the master artisan would know how to make the whole thing. Möser recognized that the products produced by this method were often better and certainly less expensive than those produced by the hometown artisans. But Möser regarded the shopkeepers who imported and sold these goods as agents of social destruction, because by importing cheaper and more desirable goods from abroad, they were undermining that artisanal guild economy on which the town's culture and political institutions had rested. And so Möser said the artisan was increasingly being displaced by the shopkeeper. He estimated that in the last century, the number of artisans in Osnabrück had fallen by about half, while the number of shopkeepers had tripled, from a very low base, of course. And so the independent artisanry was in economic decline, and with it, the urban institutions of the corporate society of Osnabrück. Imported goods had another quality that disturbed Möser, and that was their novelty. He writes that in the great cities, tastes and styles are constantly changing, while the town artisan makes his goods in the traditional way. So for Möser, the whole notion of fashion was pernicious because it was at odds with the traditional products created by the guildsmen. The shopkeeper thrived by encouraging the taste for fashion and for luxury, that is to say, by stimulating new desires. The Lord's Prayer urges, "Lead us not into temptation." But according to Möser, that was one of the roles of the shopkeeper, the local agent of the new international economy who robbed the artisan of his customers and of his livelihood. By encouraging the consumption of foreign goods at the expense of those produced locally, the shopkeeper enriched foreigners, according to Möser, while impoverishing his fellow citizens. The complaint that the lower classes were buying goods that were inappropriate for their station in life was a constant lament among 18th century conservatives. And Möser reserved his greatest hostility for the peddler, who, as he saw it, quite rightly, was the agent of the market economy in the countryside. In the primitive economy of rural Westphalia, peasants had very few opportunities to encounter goods that were made abroad. The roads were poor, and that made it difficult and hazardous to travel. So the peasants rarely visited the town and its shops. Fairs at which foreign goods might be purchased were few and far between. In such economically backward regions, the main source of foreign goods was the peddler, a man who carried his stocks on his back and marched off through the paths and byways to the homes of the peasants. Peddlers are very interesting figures in the history of capitalism. They're really the cutting edge of the spread of the capitalist market. The peasants didn't seem to most people like a very promising market. They had little to spend, and they were hard to reach. But to the peddler, a would-be merchant with little capital and no inherited status, the peasants represented an untapped market. So the peddler carried items produced outside the region and sold them in small quantities to people like the peasants who were largely outside the market economy. To Möser, the activities of the peddlers were ruining the good morals, as he called them, of the rural population by awakening new needs and new desires. Once Möser claimed the peasants had been satisfied with local products, and they didn't aspire to foreign-made goods that were above their station. It was the peddler who led them astray by encouraging them to buy items they would never have thought about on their own. The peddler led people to buy what Möser thought they didn't really need. What they did need, Möser assumed, was what they had traditionally needed. As Möser saw it, it was the aim of government policymakers like himself to protect the public from the temptation of buying products that Möser knew they didn't really need. This lament that people are buying things that they don't really need has been a recurrent one in the history of capitalism. We've already seen it, going back to the debate over luxury that we've already examined. And this lament extends into the present. As we'll see, there may be something to this lament. It's not a claim that we should dismiss lightly. But in view of this ongoing condemnation of people for buying things that the observer knows they don't really need, it's interesting to look at the products that Möser was sure the peasants didn't really need. What were these pernicious but tempting goods to which the peddler exposed unsuspecting peasants and their wives? Silk kerchiefs, linen, leather gloves, wool stockings, metal buttons, mirrors, cotton caps, knives, and needles. These are the sorts of things that the defenders of customary consumption regarded as luxuries. But it's easy to imagine that such goods simply increase the quality of life of the peasants who purchased them, making life a little bit easier, or a bit more comfortable, or a bit more colorful. Möser also saw the market and its agents as despoiling morals, because he argued the market, in the form of the peddler, drew women away from the protected confines of the household and the supervision of their husbands. The peddler, after all, appeared at the peasant's door. And if the person there was the housewife to whom the peddler was trying to sell his goods, then she was unprotected by the protective influence of her husband. Here too, Möser was a precursor of an ongoing accusation that the market comes to permeate the family, that it attacks the family at its weakest, most defenseless points. And Möser, in this case, was dismayed by this direct appeal of the peasant of the peddler to the woman without the steadying presence of her husband. Once again, the market was portrayed as the destroyer of custom and tradition. Möser also worried about another capitalist innovation that was actually changing the very structure of Osnabrück society, namely the rise of cottage industry, which provided a new way of making a living with some destabilizing social effects. Previously, the population among the peasantry had been quite stable because men and women deferred marriage until they inherited land and could support a family. And they usually inherited land when their parents were old or sick or dead. So men typically didn't marry until about the age of 30, when they inherited the family plot. And women were not too much younger. That left a relatively limited number of years of fertility, and so it limited the number of children that they produced. Now, there was the ability to earn additional income through cottage industry, and it was leading to earlier marriage and to higher fertility. Many residents of Osnabrück became more closely tied to the growing international market economy through the spread of rural, home-based manufacture, of what was sometimes called cottage industry, or the putting out system. Under this system, cloth was produced in steps by peasants in their cottages. Within their homes, some peasants would spin, others would weave, others would dye, and others would sew the resulting cloth. The system was created and it was held together by merchants who advanced the peasants the raw material and often the necessary equipment. And the merchant would move the product on through the various steps and finally market the finished product. In some parts of Europe, and Möser's Osnabrück was among them, this growth of cottage industry was creating a rapid rise in population. Möser was very aware of the impact of these new economic opportunities on the society of Osnabrück. And the social effects of these new economic patterns worried him. Because, he said, once a man could earn a living through cottage industry, he didn't have to wait to inherit the farm. He could afford to marry at 20. And under those conditions, there were much higher levels of fertility. The rate of population growth among these people was a third higher than among the traditional peasants who simply worked on their own land. And so a whole new class of people was coming into existence, people who were outside the existing social structure and its social hierarchy. They weren't lords, they weren't serfs, they weren't peasants, they weren't artisans. They didn't fit in, and they were multiplying more quickly than the economy of the town could absorb them, leading to the issue of pauperism. So Justus Möser analyzed and eloquently expressed the recurrent laments of those who see their traditional way of life destroyed by the spread of capitalism. He was among the first to state a dilemma that we'll find in many future critics of the cultural effects of the rise of the market. It was leading to new forms of production and new forms of retailing that were destroying traditional occupations. It was leading to changes in social structure that came about as a result of the new ways of making a living. It was leading to the creation of new wants and new needs that were fostered by entrepreneurs, by shopkeepers, by peddlers. Anxiety about the effects of the market was to become the most consistent theme within conservative social and political thought. To Möser, the idea of a society in which everyone knew his place sounded attractive, where you knew what your duties were, you knew what your responsibilities were, you knew that the political institutions of society were there to protect your traditional way of life. No doubt it sounds attractive to some of us as well. But who of us would rather live in Möser's world with its fixed hierarchies, determined largely by birth, its routine, and its limited material horizons. Was there a way of reconciling the institutions of the market with the sense of identity that Möser so valued in pre-capitalist Germany? That was the issue to which Hegel would turn his attention in the next generation, the generation after the French Revolution.